"You'll never keep this house without me," my husband said while I was still hooked up to and for in a hospital room overlooking the gray November parking lot. And the strange thing was, he actually believed it. Richard Carter stood at the foot of my bed in his expensive wool coat, divorce papers tucked neatly beneath his arm, like he was dropping off dry cleaning instead of ending a 34-year marriage. Outside my window, cold rain streaked across the glass, blurring the lights from the emergency entrance downstairs. I could still feel the lingering fog from anesthesia pressing against the edges of my mind, but not enough to miss the satisfaction in his face. "The attorney said you just need to sign acknowledgement of receipt," he said casually, avoiding eye contact while setting the envelope beside my untouched cup of lime jello. "This doesn't have to get ugly, Evelyn." I looked down at the papers without touching them. My name appeared there in black ink beside words like dissolution, marital property, and spousal division. 34 years reduced to legal language and numbered paragraphs. Funny how quickly a life can be condensed into paperwork. "You picked a strange time for this," I said quietly. Richard shrugged and glanced toward the hallway where nurses moved past the room every few seconds. "There's never a good time. Besides, you'll be discharged tomorrow anyway." He said it the same way someone might talk about getting new tires installed. Matter of fact. Detached. Efficient. The heart monitor beside me beeped steadily while I studied the man I'd spent more than half my life with. At 66, Richard still cared deeply about appearances. His silver hair was trimmed perfectly. His leather shoes probably cost more than most people's monthly utility bill. To everyone outside our marriage, he looked successful, dependable, respectable. But men like Richard often mistake confidence for value. They think being loud means being important. "I spoke with a realtor this morning," he continued. "We should probably list the house after the holidays. It's too much upkeep for one person." One person. Not us anymore. Just him. He had already mentally erased me from the picture. I folded my hands slowly over the thin hospital blanket and noticed the wedding ring still resting on my finger beneath the fluorescent lights. Richard followed my gaze and sighed impatiently. "Come on, Evelyn. Let's not make this emotional." Emotional. That word always appeared whenever Richard wanted to dismiss something inconvenient. I almost smiled, because what my husband didn't know was that for the past 11 years, I had quietly earned more money than he did. While he bragged at country club dinners about being the provider, I was the one paying most of the property taxes from a private consulting account he had never bothered asking about. While he believed my work was some little online bookkeeping hobby, I was managing compliance contracts for healthcare firms across 3 states, earning nearly $130,000 a year from the small office above our garage. But Richard never asked questions about things he assumed were beneath him, and I let him believe whatever made him comfortable. "You're quiet," he said carefully, almost suspicious now. "I'm tired," I answered. That part was true. Tired of being underestimated. Tired of watching my own husband confuse silence with weakness. Richard loosened his scarf and finally sat down in the chair beside my bed. "Look, this is better for both of us. We've grown apart. I need freedom while I still have time to enjoy life." There it was. The real reason. Not my surgery. Not the marriage. Not even unhappiness. Richard was chasing reinvention. Somewhere out there was a woman younger than me waiting to play audience to his midlife fantasy, and he wanted out before retirement made him feel old. "You'll get a fair settlement," he added quickly. "I'm not heartless." Fair. I nearly laughed this time. Because men like Richard always believe generosity means allowing women to keep crumbs from a table they helped build. He stood up after a moment and straightened his coat. "Think about signing before your discharge tomorrow. It'll make everything smoother." Then he walked toward the door, pausing only once before leaving. "And Evelyn," I looked up at him, "you really should start thinking realistically about money now." The door clicked shut behind him. The room fell silent except for the rain against the window and the slow rhythm of the monitor beside my bed. I stared at the divorce papers for a long time before finally reaching over and pulling the envelope into my lap. Then, for the first time since Richard walked in, I smiled. Because the man who thought he was abandoning a helpless woman had just made the biggest financial mistake of his life. The hospital discharged me the next morning just after 8:30. A young nurse named Megan wheeled me toward the main entrance while November wind rattled the glass doors ahead of us. She smiled kindly as she handed me the small paper bag containing my medications. "Do you have someone picking you up, Mrs. Carter?" she asked. I almost said my husband before remembering the envelope still sitting inside my purse. "I called a car service," I answered quietly. Megan hesitated for a second, like she wanted to ask something else, but instead she squeezed my shoulder gently and wished me well. The driver loaded my overnight bag into the trunk while cold rain misted across the parking lot. I leaned back against the seat during the 40-minute drive home and watched gray Ohio suburbs pass outside the window. Bare maple trees, wet sidewalks, Christmas decorations beginning to appear on porches even though Thanksgiving was still 2 weeks away. Everything looked normal. That was the strange part. The world never pauses when a marriage dies. When I pulled into our driveway, Richard's BMW was gone. The garage door sat half open, and for a brief moment, I allowed myself to pretend nothing had changed. But the second I stepped inside the house, I felt it. Absence has a smell. The air carried faint traces of Richard's cologne mixed with cardboard dust. I set my purse on the kitchen counter slowly and looked around. 3 framed photos were missing from the hallway wall. His golf clubs were gone from the mudroom closet. Even the expensive espresso machine he loved had disappeared from beside the stove. Richard had not just filed for divorce. He had already begun erasing himself from the house. Before I came home from surgery, I stood there quietly for several seconds with one hand pressed against the cool granite countertop. Then I walked upstairs. Half of Richard's closet was empty now. The wooden hangers swung slightly, as though they had only recently been disturbed. He had taken his winter coats, most of his watches, and the navy suitcase we used every Christmas when visiting his sister in Florida. But what caught my attention was what he left behind. Bills. Richard had always been careless with paperwork. Inside the top dresser drawer sat unopened envelopes from credit card companies, 2 past due notices, and a bank statement folded beneath a receipt from an upscale steakhouse downtown. I lowered myself carefully onto the edge of the bed, still sore from surgery, and opened the statement. The balance made my stomach tighten. Nearly $43,000 owed across multiple accounts. For years, Richard acted as though he alone carried the burden of our finances. Meanwhile, he had quietly buried himself in debt while pretending to be successful. I placed the papers back exactly where I found them. Men like Richard survive on image. They believe confidence can outlast mathematics. Downstairs, the grandfather clock in the living room chimed 11 times. I moved slowly through the house after that, noticing little details I had ignored for years. The crack near the dining room molding I paid to repair. The custom blinds I ordered after Richard complained about glare on the television. The new dishwasher purchased entirely with money from my consulting account. Piece by piece, I realized how much of this life I had quietly funded while allowing my husband to believe he was in control. My phone buzzed against the kitchen counter. A text from Richard appeared on the screen. "Remember to review the settlement proposal before Friday. We should keep lawyers out of this if possible." I stared at the message for a long moment before setting the phone face down beside the sink. Then I walked into the small office above the garage where I had worked almost every evening for the last decade. 3 computer monitors glowed softly against the dim room. Client files sat stacked neatly beside my desk. On the far screen, an unread payment notification waited in my inbox. $22,400 had just been deposited from a healthcare compliance contract in Chicago. I sat down carefully in my office chair and listened to the quiet hum of the computer. Richard thought I was coming home to panic. He thought I would spend the next few days begging him to reconsider because he genuinely believed I needed him to survive. Instead, I opened a fresh legal folder on my desktop and labeled it with 2 simple words: Carter divorce. For the next 3 days, Richard acted as though our marriage had already become a business transaction waiting to be finalized. Every message from him sounded polished and distant, like emails exchanged between coworkers instead of 2 people who once spent entire summers repainting kitchens and planting flower beds together. Tuesday morning, he texted me asking what furniture I planned to keep. Wednesday afternoon, he wanted to know whether I intended to refinance the house or agree to a sale. Not once did he ask how I was recovering from surgery. Not once did he ask whether I was eating properly or sleeping through the night. It was remarkable how quickly kindness disappears once someone believes they no longer need to pretend. By Thursday evening, the pain near my incision had dulled enough for me to work a few hours upstairs in my office. Rain tapped softly against the windows while spreadsheets glowed across my monitors. Numbers had always calmed me. Numbers told the truth even when people did not. At around 7:15, my phone lit up with a FaceTime request from my son, Daniel. I hesitated before answering. Daniel lived in Denver now with his wife, Ashley, and our conversations had become shorter over the years. Busy careers, busy schedules. Modern life always provides polite excuses for emotional distance. "Hey, Mom," he said with an awkward smile once the screen connected. Behind him, I could see the soft yellow lighting of his kitchen and hear dishes clinking faintly in the background. "Richard told me you guys are separating." There was no shock in his voice, only discomfort, which meant Richard had already been preparing the narrative before handing me those papers in the hospital. "We are," I answered calmly. Daniel rubbed the back of his neck. He had Richard's habit of avoiding eye contact during difficult conversations. "Ashley and I just want to make sure everything stays civil." Civil, another carefully chosen word. "I am not planning to burn the house down, Daniel," I said quietly. He forced a small laugh at that, relieved I was not emotional. People always seemed most comfortable when women over 60 behaved gently and predictably. "Dad says things have been tense for a while," he continued carefully. "He feels like maybe you checked out of the marriage years ago." I looked out the office window toward the dark backyard where dead leaves gathered along the fence line. Funny how quickly loneliness gets rewritten into neglect once a man wants permission to leave. "Did he also mention the debt?" I asked. Daniel blinked. "What debt?" "The credit cards, the loans, the refinancing paperwork." Silence filled the line for 2 long seconds. Then Daniel shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Dad said there were some financial pressures, but nothing serious." Of course he did. Richard had spent decades building the image of a successful provider. Country club memberships, expensive dinners, luxury watches purchased on borrowed money. Men like him rarely admit when the performance starts collapsing. "Your father owes more than you realize," I said evenly. "And most of this house survived because of my income, not his." Daniel frowned slightly. "Your income?" There it was. Genuine confusion. Even my own son had no idea. I suddenly remembered all the birthdays when Richard handed me jewelry in front of the family while I quietly paid for vacations behind the scenes. Every Christmas when Richard announced expensive gifts as though generosity belonged only to him. I had spent years protecting his pride without fully understanding the cost of doing so. "Mom," Daniel said slowly, "Dad always said your consulting work was part-time." I almost smiled. "Your father says many things." Daniel stared at me through the screen, trying to reconcile the woman he thought he knew with the one suddenly sitting in front of him. Before he could speak again, another voice drifted from somewhere behind him. "Ashley, ask her if she is keeping the house," she whispered, not realizing I could hear. Daniel muted the microphone briefly, but not before I caught the look that crossed his face. Concern. Not for me. For assets. For inheritance. For future expectations suddenly becoming uncertain. When the sound returned, his voice had changed slightly. More careful now. "What are you planning to do?" he asked. I leaned back slowly in my chair and folded my hands together. "The same thing I have always done, Daniel," I answered softly. "Handle my responsibilities." After we ended the call, I sat alone in the quiet office for a long time while the house settled around me with soft creaks and distant rattles from the heating vents. Then I opened another legal folder on my desktop and began organizing every financial document Richard never thought I would need. Saturday morning arrived with the first light snowfall of the season. Thin white flakes drifted past the kitchen windows while the coffee maker hummed softly beside me. For years I used to love mornings like this. Richard would sit at the counter reading financial news on his tablet while I made pancakes or scrambled eggs, and we would talk about ordinary things like grocery lists or vacation plans, or whether the Browns might finally have a decent season. Looking back now, I realized most of those conversations had never been real conversations at all. They were performances. Richard talked. I listened. Richard decided. I adjusted. Somewhere along the way, I became background noise in my own marriage. I carried my coffee upstairs to the office and opened the shared household printer folder Megan had helped me reconnect from the hospital. At first, I only intended to organize tax documents before meeting an attorney next week. But then I noticed a folder labeled New Beginning. The name alone made my stomach tighten slightly. I clicked it open. Inside were scanned PDFs, mortgage estimates, apartment listings in downtown Columbus, and email chains stretching back. Nearly 8 months. 8 months. Richard had been planning this while we still sat beside each other at restaurants pretending to discuss retirement travel plans. While I scheduled my surgery consultations. While I renewed our wedding anniversary reservation at the Little Inn near Lake Erie we visited every September. One email caught my attention immediately. It was between Richard and a realtor named Melissa Grant. Once the divorce is finalized, I should have access to most of the equity, Richard had written confidently. My wife does not really contribute financially, so this should stay straightforward. I stared at those words for a long moment while snow collected slowly outside the office windows. Not really contribute financially. It was almost impressive how thoroughly Richard believed his own mythology. Another email mentioned luxury condominium tours scheduled for early spring. Melissa attached smiling photos of modern kitchens, rooftop lounges, and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city skyline. Richard had replied, "Perfect for a fresh start." Fresh start. Men always choose optimistic language when abandoning old responsibilities. My eyes drifted lower through the thread until I found another message sent just 3 weeks before my surgery. "I think she suspects something," Richard wrote. "But Evelyn avoids conflict. She will probably just sign and move on quietly." I leaned back slowly in my chair and closed my eyes for a second. That sentence hurt more than the divorce papers themselves. Not because he underestimated me financially. Because after 34 years together, the only thing my husband truly believed about me was that I would stay quiet to make life easier for him. The office felt colder suddenly. I wrapped my cardigan tighter around my shoulders and kept reading. There were references to dinner reservations, expensive wine purchases, and weekends Richard supposedly spent attending golf retreats. Only now did the pattern become obvious. The missing weekends. The sudden concern about his appearance. The gym membership he insisted was about heart health. I did not need explicit details to understand there had been someone else waiting in the background while my marriage slowly dissolved in secret. What surprised me most was not the betrayal. It was how ordinary it all looked on paper. No dramatic declarations. No grand romance. Just middle-aged selfishness hidden beneath polished emails and restaurant receipts. My phone buzzed across the desk, pulling me from my thoughts. Claire Benson. I had not spoken to her in nearly 2 months. "I heard about Richard," she said gently the second I answered. "Claire and I met 30 years ago volunteering at a hospital fundraiser, and unlike most people in my life, she had always noticed things others ignored." "How bad is it?" she asked quietly. I looked back at the glowing screen filled with Richard's carefully organized exit strategy. "Worse than I thought," I admitted. Claire exhaled slowly. "Evelyn, there is something you need to know." Her voice changed slightly then. More cautious. "I saw Richard downtown 3 weeks ago at Marlowe's Steakhouse. He was not alone." I did not answer immediately. Outside, snow continued falling over the backyard in soft silence. "Was she young?" I asked finally. Claire hesitated. "Young enough to make him feel important." I thanked her calmly after a few more minutes and ended the call. Then I reopened the emails and began forwarding every document to a private encrypted folder Richard did not know existed. Because for the first time since this nightmare began, I realized something important. Richard had spent months preparing to leave me, but he never once prepared for the possibility that I might stop protecting him. Monday morning smelled like burnt coffee and frozen pavement when I drove downtown to meet my attorney. The sky hung low and gray over Columbus, turning every office building window into dull silver mirrors. I parked across from a small brick law office near Franklin Park and sat inside my car for a moment with both hands resting on the steering wheel. I had not needed a lawyer in my entire adult life. Not for business. Not for taxes. Not even when my father passed away 15 years earlier. Back then, Richard handled everything while I quietly trusted him to protect our future together. Funny how trust feels noble right until the moment it becomes expensive. The elevator inside the building groaned softly as it carried me to the 4th floor. My attorney, Sandra Whitmore, greeted me with calm eyes and a firm handshake. She looked to be somewhere in her late 50s, polished without trying too hard. The kind of woman who had probably spent years listening to wealthy men underestimate her before quietly dismantling them in courtrooms. "Mrs. Carter," she said warmly, "please come in." Her office overlooked the snowy street below. Framed law degrees lined the walls beside shelves packed with thick financial litigation binders. Sandra motioned toward a leather chair while her assistant brought coffee and bottled water. I reviewed the preliminary documents your husband's attorney sent over. She began carefully once we sat down. He appears very confident about the division proposal. I almost smiled at the wording. Very confident. Richard has always enjoyed confidence, I said softly. Sandra slid the settlement packet across the desk toward me. According to this filing, your husband believes the marital home should be sold immediately, and he is requesting a majority share of the liquid assets due to what he describes as his primary role as financial provider throughout the marriage. There it was again. Provider. The mythology continued. I reached into my bag and handed Sandra a neatly organized folder containing tax returns, investment summaries, consulting contracts, and banking records going back nearly 11 years. I thought you should see these first, I said quietly. Sandra opened the folder casually at first. Then her expression changed. Her eyes moved across the pages once. Then again more slowly. These are your accounts? She asked. Yes. And your consulting income average between $120,000 and $135,000 annually. Correct. Sandra leaned back slightly in her chair and removed her glasses. For the first time since entering the office, she looked genuinely surprised. Did your husband disclose any of this in his financial affidavit? She asked carefully. I do not believe he knows. Silence settled between us for a brief second while snow drifted outside the windows beyond her desk. Then Sandra gave the smallest smile I had seen all morning. Not amusement. Recognition. Mrs. Carter, she said calmly, your husband may have made a very serious mistake. I folded my hands together quietly while she continued reviewing the documents. Every few moments another detail shifted the atmosphere in the room further. Retirement accounts funded largely through my income. Emergency mortgage payments transferred from my business account during the recession. Property taxes paid consistently from consulting deposits Richard apparently never noticed. Years of invisible labor hidden behind Richard's louder performance of success. He filed this assuming you were financially dependent, Sandra said finally. Completely. I looked toward the snowy street below. Richard likes being admired. He never asks questions that might interfere with that. Sandra nodded slowly. Men like that usually believe paperwork only matters when they control it. Then she opened another section of Richard's filings and frowned. There are also inconsistencies here. Debt? I asked. She looked up immediately. You already know? I thought about the hidden statements in Richard's dresser drawer and the luxury condo emails waiting in my encrypted folder at home. I know enough. Sandra closed the file carefully and folded her hands atop the desk. Mrs. Carter, I need to ask you something directly. Are you interested in a peaceful settlement? Or are you prepared for full financial discovery? The room grew very quiet after that. Somewhere beyond the office walls, a printer hummed faintly while phones rang in distant reception areas. I thought about the hospital room, the divorce papers beside the lime jello cup, Richard telling me to start thinking realistically about money. Then I looked Sandra directly in the eyes for the first time since arriving. I am interested, I said softly, in the truth becoming expensive. The first official mediation meeting was scheduled for the following Thursday at 10:05 in the morning. Sandra told me beforehand that these sessions were usually controlled performances. One side entered confident. The other entered emotional. Then lawyers translated pain into percentages while pretending the process felt civilized. I arrived early wearing a charcoal wool coat and carrying a leather folder filled with documents Richard still did not know existed. Downtown Columbus looked frozen beneath pale winter sunlight. Snow from earlier in the week clung to curbs and parking meters in dirty gray piles, while people hurried past office buildings holding paper coffee cups against the cold. Inside the mediation office, everything smelled faintly like lemon cleaner and expensive carpet. Sandra met me in the lobby with the calm expression of someone already 3 steps ahead mentally. You look stronger, she said quietly as we walked toward the conference room. I am stronger, I answered. That was true too. Surgery pain had mostly faded now, replaced by something steadier. Clarity. Richard was already seated when we entered. He wore a navy blazer and one of his bright silk ties, the kind he saved for occasions when he wanted to appear successful and reasonable. Beside him sat his attorney, Vanessa Hale, a sharp-featured woman with perfect posture and a stack of color-coded files arranged neatly across the table. Richard glanced up briefly when I entered, then looked away almost immediately. No apology, no warmth, only mild irritation that I had shown up looking composed instead of broken. "Evelyn," he said with a thin smile. "You look well." I took my seat across from him slowly and folded my hands together. "Thank you." Vanessa opened the meeting with polished professionalism. She spoke about efficiency, fairness, and mutual respect while outlining Richard's proposed settlement terms. Sell the marital home. Divide retirement accounts. Limit spousal support due to Richard's primary financial contributions throughout the marriage. Every sentence rested on the same assumption. Richard had carried me. Richard had funded our life. Richard deserved protection from a dependent spouse. Sandra remained silent for most of it, occasionally making notes with a black fountain pen while Richard grew more comfortable by the minute. I recognized that version of him immediately. The public Richard. Relaxed. Charming. Certain the room already belonged to him. Naturally, Richard added casually at one point, "I want Evelyn to remain financially stable after everything is finalized." Stable. As though I were a retired schoolteacher surviving on coupons and social security checks instead of a woman quietly managing six-figure contracts from a home office he ignored for a decade. Vanessa slid another document across the table. "This reflects Mr. Carter's understanding of the marital finances," she explained. Sandra finally looked up then. "Interesting," she said softly. The room shifted slightly after that. Not visibly at first, just a subtle tightening beneath the surface. Sandra opened the folder I brought with me and began placing documents carefully across the polished conference table one by one. Tax returns, corporate payment summaries, investment portfolios, consulting contracts. Richard frowned immediately. Vanessa adjusted her glasses and leaned closer. Silence stretched across the room as pages turned. Then another silence. Longer this time. Richard looked confused at first, then uncomfortable. "What exactly is this?" he asked slowly. Sandra answered without emotion. "Verified income documentation for Mrs. Carter covering the last 11 years. Richard blinked. "Income." Sandra slid one final sheet toward him. "Average annual earnings between $120,000 and $135,000. Independent of marital business assets." The color drained from Richard's face so quickly it almost looked painful. "That cannot be right," he said immediately. "Evelyn worked part-time from home." I looked at him quietly across the conference table while snow drifted outside the tall office windows behind him. "No, Richard," I said softly. "You just never asked." Vanessa turned slowly toward her client then, and for the first time since this process began, I watched confidence leave Richard's body in real time. Not dramatically, not loudly, just a slow collapse behind the eyes. Sandra continued speaking after that, calmly outlining discrepancies in Richard's disclosures, hidden debt, personal credit lines, condo inquiries, expense patterns inconsistent with his declared assets. Each sentence stripped away another layer of the life Richard spent years performing for everyone around him. Richard stared down at the documents in front of him like a man reading a language he no longer understood. Finally, he looked up at me directly for the first time all morning. "You hid this from me?" he asked quietly. I held his gaze steadily across the table. "No," I answered. "You ignored it." The mediation ended 40 minutes later than scheduled because Richard kept insisting there had to be some misunderstanding. Not anger at first. Confusion. Genuine confusion. As though numbers themselves had betrayed him personally. Vanessa remained professional, but I noticed the subtle change in her posture once the full financial picture became clear. She no longer spoke to Richard with automatic confidence. She spoke to him carefully, like someone realizing halfway through surgery that the scans were wrong. Outside the conference room, the hallway smelled faintly of burnt coffee and copier toner, while office employees moved quietly between doors carrying legal folders against their chests. Richard followed me out after Sandra stepped away to take a phone call. "Evelyn." His voice sounded lower now, stripped of performance. I stopped near the elevator but did not turn immediately. "You should have told me," he said once I faced him. The sentence almost made me laugh. 34 years together, and suddenly the problem was communication. "You never wanted a partner, Richard," I answered calmly. "You wanted an audience." He flinched slightly at that, just enough for me to notice. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Snow drifted slowly beyond the tall lobby windows downstairs, while distant traffic moved through the city in soft gray lines. Richard looked older suddenly. Not physically, spiritually. Like someone realizing too late that confidence borrowed against illusion eventually comes due. Was any of it real? He asked quietly. The marriage. I studied him carefully before answering. I think it was real for me. That seemed to hurt him. More than anger would have. Sandra returned a few seconds later carrying another folder beneath her arm. We will continue formal discovery next week, she said evenly while pressing the elevator button. Richard nodded distractedly, still staring at me with an expression I had not seen from him in years. Uncertainty. The ride home felt strangely peaceful. Winter sunlight reflected off frozen sidewalks while holiday decorations flickered faintly from storefront windows downtown. I stopped at a small grocery store near the house and bought fresh soup ingredients, herbal tea, and flowers for the kitchen table. White tulips. Richard always hated tulips because he thought they looked unfinished before blooming. I bought them anyway. At home, the silence no longer felt hostile. It felt honest. I moved slowly through the house that evening, noticing details I had ignored for years. The expensive wine fridge Richard insisted we needed despite barely using it. The leather recliner purchased after his brief obsession with luxury home magazines. Entire corners of our life built around his image of success rather than actual happiness. Around 6:30, my phone rang again. Daniel. I answered while stirring soup on the stove. Dad called me, he said immediately. He says there was some kind of misunderstanding during mediation. I lowered the heat beneath the pot and waited quietly. Mom, Daniel continued carefully. Is it true you were making more money than him all these years? The question sounded almost childlike. Not accusatory, just disoriented. Yes. Silence stretched across the line. Then he exhaled slowly. Why did you never tell anyone? I looked around the kitchen where soft yellow light reflected against the windows into the dark backyard beyond. Because I was busy keeping things stable, I answered. And your father needed to feel important more than I needed recognition. Daniel did not respond immediately. In the background, I could hear Ashley speaking softly somewhere near him, though I could not make out the words. Finally, he said, Dad thought you depended on him. I know. Did you ever love him? That question surprised me more than anything else. All week, I leaned one hand against the kitchen counter and watched steam rise slowly from the soup pot. Very much, I said quietly. That is why I stayed quiet for so long. After the call ended, I carried my dinner into the living room and sat beside the fireplace with a blanket wrapped loosely around my shoulders. Snow continued falling outside in soft silence while the grandfather clock ticked steadily across the room. Somewhere downtown, Richard was probably trying to reconstruct his version of reality before it collapsed completely. But the truth was simpler than he wanted to believe. I had never hidden my strength from him. He simply never respected me enough to notice it. 2 weeks later, Richard asked to meet privately before the next mediation session. The message arrived just after 7 in the morning while I was reviewing client reports upstairs in my office. Can we talk without attorneys? He wrote. I think things got out of hand. I stared at the screen for a long moment before setting my phone aside and continuing to work. Outside, December snow covered the neighborhood in clean white silence. A delivery truck crawled slowly down the street while someone nearby used a snowblower against the sidewalk. Ordinary winter sounds. Ordinary life continuing while marriages quietly collapsed behind closed doors all over America. Richard called again around noon. This time I answered. I think we should handle this differently, he said immediately. His voice carried none of the polished certainty from the hospital room weeks earlier. Differently how? I asked calmly. He hesitated. There are things we both could have done better. Interesting how accountability only appears once leverage changes hands. I swiveled slowly in my office chair and looked toward the framed certifications hanging beside my desk. For years, Richard walked past those walls without ever reading them closely. To him, my office had simply been the room where Evelyn answered emails while he handled real finances. Sandra says you failed to disclose several liabilities. I replied evenly. That complicates things. Richard exhaled heavily into the phone. I did not intentionally hide anything. That sentence told me everything I needed to know. Men like Richard rarely lie outright. They simply rearrange truth until it flatters them. What exactly do you want from me? I asked. Silence stretched for several seconds before he finally answered. I want us to stop treating each other like enemies. I almost admired the timing. 3 weeks earlier, he handed me divorce papers beside a hospital bed while assuming I would panic financially. Now suddenly, he wanted dignity and cooperation. "Richard," I said softly, "you started treating me like an inconvenience long before you treated me like an enemy." He did not respond. Somewhere on his end of the line, I heard faint restaurant noise and silverware clinking against plates. Probably another expensive lunch charged to a credit card he could not actually afford. "Who is she?" I asked quietly. The silence after that question felt heavier. Not because I needed confirmation, because hearing the truth spoken aloud changes the shape of betrayal permanently. "Her name is Melissa," he admitted finally. It was not supposed to happen this way. Melissa, the realtor from the emails. I closed my eyes briefly while winter sunlight reflected softly across the office carpet. "How long?" "About 7 months. 7 months. Almost the exact length of time he spent planning his exit strategy." "Does she know about the debt?" I asked calmly. Richard sounded startled. "What?" "The credit cards. The condo inquiries. The loans." Another silence. Then a quieter voice. "Not everything." "Of course not." Richard did not love women. He loved admiration. And admiration depends heavily on selective information. Later that afternoon, Sandra forwarded me updated financial discovery reports from Vanessa's office. Hidden beneath the revised disclosures sat something almost sad in its predictability. Richard had liquidated portions of his retirement fund 6 months earlier to maintain appearances. Luxury dinners, weekend trips, gifts, hotel charges, thousands of dollars spent trying to purchase a younger version of himself through someone else's attention. I printed the reports slowly while the office printer hummed beside my desk. Then I carried the papers downstairs and placed them neatly inside the kitchen drawer where Richard used to keep unpaid bills hidden beneath takeout menus. That evening, Daniel arrived unexpectedly just after sunset. Snow clung to his coat shoulders as he stepped into the house, carrying a bakery box from the Italian place downtown I used to love. He looked exhausted. Older somehow. "Dad is falling apart," he admitted quietly once we sat at the kitchen table. "Ashley says he barely sleeps anymore." I poured tea carefully into 2 mugs and watched steam curl upward between us. "Your father spent his whole life believing control and respect were the same thing," I said softly. "Now he is learning they are not." Daniel looked around the kitchen slowly, as though seeing the house differently for the first time. "I never realized how much you handled," he admitted. "None of us did." I smiled faintly and wrapped both hands around my mug. "That is the danger of quiet women, Daniel. People assume we are doing nothing simply because we are not announcing it." The divorce finalized in early March on a cold Thursday morning with freezing rain tapping softly against the courthouse windows. There was no dramatic courtroom speech. No shouting. No revenge scene worthy of television. Just signatures, legal language, and the quiet collapse of a life Richard once believed he controlled completely. By then, most of the illusions had already fallen apart on their own. Melissa disappeared sometime in February after the financial disclosures became impossible to ignore. Sandra told me Vanessa mentioned it privately during settlement discussions. Apparently, Melissa had assumed Richard owned far more than he actually did. Once the debt surfaced and the condo plans vanished, so did she. I was not surprised. Relationships built on performance rarely survive exposure. Richard looked smaller the day we finalized everything. Not physically smaller, just diminished somehow. The expensive confidence he carried for decades no longer fit correctly. His suit still looked polished. His watch still gleamed beneath courthouse lighting. But the certainty was gone. People underestimate how visible certainty becomes once it disappears. We stood beside each other in silence after the final paperwork was signed while attorneys exchanged copies across the long wooden table. Outside, traffic moved slowly through wet downtown streets below the courthouse windows. Richard cleared his throat softly before speaking. "I never wanted things to end like this." I looked at him calmly. "You just never imagined they could end differently." That seemed to settle heavily between us. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for him. Not because he lost money. Because he spent most of his life believing admiration was the same thing as love, and now he was old enough to realize the difference mattered. By spring, the house sold quietly to a younger family relocating from Chicago. I watched movers carry boxes through empty rooms while sunlight stretched across hardwood floors Richard and I once refinished together during our 30s. Strange how memory lingers inside walls long after trust leaves them. I did not cry when I locked the front door for the last time. Some endings deserve grief. Others deserve release. I moved into a smaller townhouse near Lake Erie with wide windows overlooking the water and a small office upstairs perfect for consulting work. The first morning there, I woke before sunrise and stood barefoot in the kitchen watching pale light spread slowly across the lake. No tension, no performance, no careful shrinking of myself to protect someone else's ego. Just silence. Honest silence. Daniel visited more often after the divorce finalized. Not out of guilt exactly. More out of awakening. One afternoon while helping me assemble bookshelves in the upstairs office, he stopped suddenly and looked around the room. "You seem lighter now," he said quietly. I smiled faintly while arranging client binders on the shelf beside the window. I spent years carrying things that were never mine to carry. He nodded slowly, like someone finally understanding his childhood from an entirely different angle. Richard called once in late April. The number appeared on my phone while I was reviewing contracts at my desk overlooking the lake. I let it ring twice before answering. I drove. "By the old neighborhood today," he said softly. "The tulips are blooming." I glanced toward the small white flowers growing beneath my own front window outside. "Yes," I answered. Silence settled between us for several seconds. Then Richard exhaled quietly into the phone. "I really did not know you all those years, did I?" I thought about the hospital room. The divorce papers beside the lime jello cup. The way he told me to think realistically about money while believing I was weak because I stayed quiet. Then I looked out across the lake where evening sunlight shimmered softly against the water in long silver lines. "No," I said calmly. "You only knew the version of me that made you comfortable." After we hung up, I returned to work while gulls drifted beyond the windows and waves rolled steadily against the shore below. At 62 years old, I finally understood something that would have changed my entire life if I had learned it earlier. There is a difference between being unseen and being powerless. Richard spent 34 years mistaking the two, and by the time he realized his mistake, I was already gone.